It is July 16th, 2026, and the sky over southern Iran is still burning. In the last 72 hours, American precision munitions have torn through coastal defense grids, missile storage sites, and command infrastructure along a coastline that stretches from the Strait of Hormuz to the northern edge of the Persian Gulf. Footage circulating out of the region shows fireballs rolling upward into the night sky over multiple cities at once, secondary explosions cascading for minutes after the initial impact. The unmistakable signature of ordnance depots and rocket propellant catching fire in a chain reaction that engineers call sympathetic detonation. This is not a symbolic strike. This is not a warning shot. This is the U.S. military systematically dismantling the operational backbone of Iran's Revolutionary Guard, and the question everyone in the region is now asking is how much of Iran's underground arsenal is actually left standing. But to understand why American bombers are back over Iranian airspace tonight, you need to back all the way up, because nothing about this moment is spontaneous. This war has been grinding forward in phases since February, pausing, flaring, pausing again, each ceasefire lasting just long enough for both sides to rearm before collapsing under its own weight. And the newest collapse, the one producing the footage everyone is watching right now, traces back to a single decision made in Tehran less than 2 weeks ago. The current war began on February 28, 2026, when Israeli and American strikes hit Iranian targets simultaneously in an operation the United States codenamed Epic Fury and Israel called Roaring Lion, a continuation of the earlier Rising Lion campaign against Iran's nuclear infrastructure. The opening hours of that war were engineered with a level of deception that intelligence analysts are still studying. In the days before the first strikes, Israeli commanders reportedly drove their official vehicles home from military headquarters and left them there so that satellite imagery would show empty parking lots and unarmed aircraft, projecting a false sense of normalcy right up until the moment the strikes began. 3 separate gatherings of senior Iranian officials were hit within 30 seconds of each other in that opening wave. Days later, Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, was killed in an Israeli air attack on February 28th, with his death confirmed by Iranian state media on March 1st. His daughter, son-in-law, grandchild, and daughter-in-law were killed alongside him. The man who had ruled Iran's theocracy for more than 3 decades was gone within the first 72 hours of the war, and the country has been operating under a fractured, contested leadership structure ever since. That is the part most casual observers of this conflict have never fully processed. Iran has been fighting this war, negotiating ceasefires, and issuing threats to the United States without its supreme leader. Whoever is actually steering strategy inside Tehran right now is doing so through a chain of command that lost its central node in the opening days of the war, and that fracture has shaped almost everything that has happened since, including the erratic, contradictory statements coming out of Iranian officials this week. The war ground on through March. On March 21st, the United States struck the Natanz nuclear facility using bunker-buster bombs, prompting condemnation from Russia and an urgent appeal from the International Atomic Energy Agency to avoid any risk of a nuclear accident. Iran responded by striking the southern Israeli town of Dimona, injuring at least 78 people, claiming it had targeted the Shimon Peres Negev Nuclear Research Center. According to reporting from CNN and the Wall Street Journal citing U.S. officials, Iran also attempted to strike the joint American-British base at Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean, an attack that failed when one missile broke apart mid-flight and another was intercepted by a Navy warship. By the time a 2-week ceasefire took hold on April 8th, Admiral Brad Cooper, the commander of U.S. Central Command, said American forces had struck more than 8,000 Iranian military targets, including 130 vessels. 8,000 targets. Sit with that number for a second, because it tells you something important about the scale of what has already happened in this war before we even get to the strikes making headlines today. That April ceasefire didn't hold. It came under strain almost immediately after Israel struck Lebanon, and Iran refused to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which roughly 1/5 of the world's oil and gas shipments passed before the war began. Talks in Islamabad in mid-April collapsed, and the United States responded by imposing its first naval blockade of the conflict. For nearly 2 months after that, the war simmered through blockade, partial ceasefire, and renewed threats, until on June 17th, in a moment that briefly looked like it might actually end things, President Trump and Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian signed a memorandum in Versailles, formally ending the active exchange of strikes. The dual blockade lifted the following day. For about 10 days, it looked like the war might actually be over. It wasn't. On June 28th, after renewed clashes, the two sides agreed to another ceasefire. And then on July 8th, that interim deal collapsed entirely, after attacks from both sides that Iranian state media said killed 8 of its soldiers in strikes on Bandar Abbas and Bushehr, and after Mehr News Agency reported that 2 Iranian fishermen had been killed in a separate American strike. President Trump declared the memorandum over, saying he no longer had the desire to keep negotiating with Iran's leadership. though he left the door open for his negotiators to keep talking, even as he expressed open pessimism about where it would lead. That brings us to the immediate trigger for what has happened this week. According to Trump's own notification explaining the resumption of military operations, the memorandum required the Iranian government to make its best efforts to ensure the safe passage of commercial vessels transiting from the Persian Gulf to the Sea of Oman. Despite that commitment, Iran attacked multiple neutral-flagged commercial tankers transiting the Strait of Hormuz between July 6th and July 7th. Trump ordered military action to begin on July the 7th, but notably, he specified that only maritime resources were being used at that stage, not ground forces, an early sign that Washington was trying to keep the retaliation contained to a specific domain, even as it escalated in intensity. It didn't stay contained for long. U.S. Central Command said it struck 140 targets in that opening wave, hitting missile and drone launch sites, ammunition depots, and communications infrastructure. Iranian media reported that Tehran retaliated by launching ballistic missiles from western and central Iran toward American positions in the Gulf. Iran's Revolutionary Guard claimed its forces had hit facilities in Jaffa, Bahrain, and destroyed 2 radar installations in Oman, and separately claimed through the state news agency IRNA that its aerospace force had destroyed fuel depots and a Patriot air defense battery at the American base in Ali al-Salem, Kuwait, along with a strategic radar system at Ahmed al-Jaber base. None of those specific Iranian claims have been independently confirmed, and that distinction matters. Throughout this war, Iranian state media has repeatedly issued damage claims that outside verification has later failed to substantiate. Treat those claims as what they are, unverified assertions from a party with every incentive to project strength it may not actually possess. What is confirmed, through American reporting and satellite tracking, is where the U.S. strikes landed. Hormozgan and Khuzestan provinces in Iran's south were hit, along with Markazi province near Tehran, where at least 2 people were killed. Additional strikes hit Sistan and Baluchistan provinces along the southeastern border near the waterway. This is Iran's entire southern military posture, its coastal defense architecture, being systematically worked over in a matter of days. And here is where it gets significantly worse for Tehran. Trump posted on Truth Social that the Strait of Hormuz is open and will remain open, with or without Iran, and announced that the United States was reinstating what he called the Iranian blockade, effective at 1600 Eastern Time. This is the second blockade the U.S. has imposed on Iran in 3 months. Iran's Revolutionary Guard responded by claiming the strait is our territory, and asserting it had closed the waterway again, deepening the uncertainty over whether commercial traffic could actually move through safely. The United Kingdom, watching all of this unfold, moved this week to formally designate Iran and the IRGC as a terrorist organization, a diplomatic escalation that will make it significantly harder for Tehran to access international financial systems and legitimate trade channels going forward. Then, on Wednesday, the exchanges accelerated again. U.S. Central Command completed a 90-minute wave of strikes against coastal defense systems and cruise missile storage and launch sites on Greater Tunb Island, one of the small but strategically vital islands controlling approaches to the strait. CENTCOM said the strikes further degraded Iran's ability to threaten commercial shipping. In response, Iran's Revolutionary Guard claimed overnight attacks on American military assets across Bahrain, Kuwait, and Jordan, asserting it had inflicted heavy damage on the U.S. Fifth Fleet headquarters and fuel tanks in Bahrain, a major logistics hub at Mina Abdullah in Kuwait, and shelters housing F-15, F-16, and F-35 fighter jets along with several MQ-9 Reaper drones. Again, none of that has been independently verified, and skepticism is warranted given the pattern of inflated Iranian claims throughout this war. What is confirmed is that Jordan's military intercepted and shot down 3 Iranian ballistic missiles that entered its airspace early Wednesday morning, a detail that matters enormously, because it means this conflict is no longer contained to Iran, Israel, and direct American assets in the Gulf. It is now pulling in third countries' airspace and air defense systems, and every additional country forced to shoot down an incoming missile is a country with a growing incentive to get involved in ending this war by any means necessary. Now let's talk about the specific footage everyone is circulating right now, because the visual evidence tells its own story. Explosions captured near Dezful in southern Iran show what analysts assess as the detonation of a munition in roughly the 5,000-pound class, based on the fireball diameter and the pattern of secondary explosions that follow. This is smaller than the massive ordnance air blast bomb, the so-called mother of all bombs, which is a 10,000-pound weapon designed primarily for surface destruction and psychological effect, rather than deep penetration. What the Dezful footage shows instead has the signature of a penetrating weapon that punched through a hardened structure and ignited what's stored inside it, evidenced by the repeated secondary flashes rippling outward from the initial impact point over the following minutes. That pattern Sequential secondary explosions, rather than a single blast, is the classic signature of a strike on an ammunition or missile propellant storage site. When a 5,000-pound penetrator opens up a hardened bunker holding rocket motors and warheads, the fire doesn't just burn, it propagates from one stored round to the next in a chain that can last far longer than the initial detonation. That's very likely what people are watching when they see the sky over Dezful lit up in that extended fireworks-like sequence. This is where the conversation has to shift to the weapon everyone actually wants to talk about, the one still sitting unused in American bomb bays as of this week. The GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator. This is a 30,000-pound precision-guided bunker buster, the largest non-nuclear weapon in the American arsenal, and it can only be carried and delivered by one aircraft in the world, the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber. The weapon's design purpose is narrow and specific. It is built to penetrate through more than 60 feet of reinforced concrete or hardened rock before detonating, meaning it doesn't destroy a target by blast overpressure at the surface the way conventional bombs do. It destroys a target by punching deep into the earth first, and then exploding from the inside, collapsing tunnels, crushing command spaces, and denying an adversary the ability to shelter critical infrastructure underground, which has been the cornerstone of Iran's entire defensive doctrine for its nuclear and command infrastructure for the better part of 2 decades. This weapon has already been used twice in this broader conflict, and both instances explain exactly why Iranian planners have to be losing sleep over what might come next. On June 22, 2025, 7 B-2 bombers dropped 14 GBU-57 bombs against Iranian nuclear-related sites in what the U.S. called Operation Midnight Hammer, the first operational combat use of the weapon in history. Then, on April 7th of this year, according to Wall Street Journal reporting, B-2 bombers struck an underground IRGC compound near Tehran with the same weapon, after American intelligence identified a concentration of senior Revolutionary Guard commanders sheltering inside it. That strike was ordered by Admiral Cooper in the middle of an active personnel recovery mission for a downed American F-15E crew, meaning the United States was simultaneously running a rescue operation and a dynamic strike against a fleeting high-value target on the same night, in the same airspace. American B-1 bombers reportedly dropped roughly 100 2,000-pound class bombs during that same recovery mission, specifically to push Iranian ground forces away from the rescue corridor. That is not a picture of a military improvising. That is a picture of a fused intelligence and strike architecture that can identify a leadership target, authorize a strategic bomber mission from the continental United States, and execute it inside a live combat rescue window, all in the same night. Consider what actually has to happen for a mission like that to work. A B-2 launching from White Man Air Force Base in Missouri is flying a round trip that covers thousands of miles, requiring multiple aerial refuelings from tanker aircraft along the route, all while maintaining the kind of radar cross-section that lets it slip through some of the most heavily contested airspace in the world without being engaged. The aircraft itself carries 2 GBU-57 penetrators internally in bays designed to preserve its stealth profile even while carrying 30 tons of ordnance. None of that happens on a whim. Target coordinates have to be refined down to a level of precision that accounts for the exact geological composition of the rock or concrete the weapon needs to punch through, because the fusing on a penetrator, like the GBU-57, is calibrated to count the number of floors or layers it passes through before detonating at the optimal depth, rather than simply exploding on contact or after a fixed delay. Get that calibration wrong, and the weapon either detonates too early, wasting most of its destructive potential on the uppermost layers, or punches all the way through without ever engaging the structure it was meant to destroy. That is the level of targeting precision that separates a demonstration strike from an actual kill against a hardened facility, and it's why strikes against sites like the April IRGC bunker near Tehran get treated as major operational milestones, rather than routine bombing runs. The reason this technical detail keeps coming back to Pickaxe Mountain specifically is that everything about the facility's design appears oriented around defeating exactly this kind of penetrating strike. Multiple tunnel entrances mean the facility isn't dependent on a single point of access that could be sealed by one well-placed weapon. Depth inside a mountain range, rather than beneath flat desert terrain, means any penetrator has to fight through solid rock rather than looser soil or reinforced concrete alone, which changes the physics of how deep a given weapon can actually travel before it either loses enough kinetic energy to stop short or detonates. That's precisely why analysts have spent years speculating about whether even the GBU-57, the largest conventional penetrator in the American arsenal, has the raw kinetic capability to reach whatever sits at the facility's core, or whether defeating it would require multiple weapons landing on the same aim point in sequence, each one boring slightly deeper into the crater left by the one before it, a tactic American planners have reportedly rehearsed against other hardened targets in the same region. Read that carefully. because it explains the strategic logic sitting underneath everything happening right now. The United States has already demonstrated it can find and destroy underground IRGC command infrastructure on short notice, twice, using the exact weapon capable of reaching Iran's most protected facility. That facility has a name that keeps surfacing in this war. A site built deep into the Zagros mountain range that analysts and satellite imagery specialists have referred to as Pickaxe Mountain. The International Atomic Energy Agency reported last week that satellite analysis shows continued construction and security upgrades at the site, despite the terms of the June memorandum, work that has reportedly been underway since at least 2020. International inspectors have never been granted access. Its depth inside the mountain has fueled years of speculation that it was purpose-built to withstand exactly the kind of penetrating strike the GBU-57 is designed to deliver, and outside experts largely agree that if there is one Iranian facility genuinely engineered to survive an American bunker buster campaign, this is the one. Trump has publicly signaled the site is a live target for further action. Given that the GBU-57 and the B-2 have already been used against hardened Iranian targets twice this year, the infrastructure to strike Pickaxe Mountain a third time isn't theoretical. It's sitting on a runway at Whiteman Air Force Base right now. It's worth sitting with why the Strait of Hormuz specifically carries this much weight in the first place, because the geography here is almost absurdly unforgiving. At its narrowest point, the strait is only about 21 miles wide, and the actual shipping lanes used by tankers are far narrower than that, funneled into two 2-mile-wide channels separated by a buffer zone. All of it within range of Iranian shore batteries, fast attack boats, and the exact cruise missile sites the U.S. has spent the last week trying to destroy on Greater Tunb Island and along the southern coast. Before this war began, roughly 1/5 of the entire world's oil and gas shipments passed through that choke point every single day. There is no meaningful alternative route that can absorb that volume on short notice. The pipelines that exist, including the Saudi system built specifically to bypass Hormuz, can reroute a meaningful slice of crude, but nowhere near all of it, which is exactly why global energy markets react so violently every time Iran even threatens closure, let alone when it fires on tankers directly, as it did on July 6th and 7th. That vulnerability is precisely why control of this waterway has become the central bargaining chip of the entire war. Iran doesn't need to defeat the American military to inflict real economic pain on the rest of the world. It just needs to keep the strait contested long enough to keep insurance premiums, shipping delays, and oil prices elevated, which is a far cheaper strategy than trying to match American air power directly. Let's talk about what the last week has actually cost Iran in hard operational terms, because the numbers tell a story the rhetoric can't hide. Israeli strikes on the South Pars petrochemical facility in Asaluya reportedly took 85% of Iran's petrochemical export capacity offline. At least 34 people, including 6 children, were killed in a wave of joint U.S. Israeli strikes that hit targets including Sharif University of Technology and residential areas earlier in this war, a toll that has drawn condemnation even from reform-minded Iranian officials, who otherwise have no love for the Revolutionary Guard's leadership. As of June, independent estimates put the cost of this war to American taxpayers at $113 billion, a number that is only climbing with every additional strike package, every additional carrier rotation, every additional bomber sortie flown from the continental United States. And on the Iranian side, the currency of this war isn't measured in dollars, it's measured in the systematic destruction of the physical infrastructure the IRGC has spent decades building specifically to survive a war like this one. Coastal missile batteries, radar installations, cruise missile storage sites hidden along the shoreline, and now, reportedly, senior command nodes hidden underground in the capital itself. There's a second front that opened this week that deserves just as much attention as the strikes on Iran's coastline, because it shows how fast this war is metastasizing outward into the wider region. On July 13th, Saudi Arabia struck the runway at Sana'a International Airport in Houthi-controlled Yemen, specifically to prevent an Iranian aircraft from landing there. That aircraft was carrying a Houthi delegation returning from the funeral of Iran's slain supreme leader in Tehran, and Riyadh viewed the direct flight as a deliberate breach of a years-long air blockade designed to choke off Iranian arms and personnel access to the Houthis. The Houthi delegation's plane ultimately diverted and landed at another Houthi-controlled airport instead, but the message had already been sent. Within hours, the Houthis retaliated with a coordinated drone and missile assault on Abha International Airport in southern Saudi Arabia, the worst direct attack the kingdom has faced from the group in years, and one that shattered a truce between Riyadh and the Houthis that had held since 2022. A Houthi military spokesman went further, warning international airlines to avoid Saudi airspace entirely and threatening to strike King Khalid Airport in Riyadh itself if Saudi Arabia didn't lift what the group called its siege of Sana'a. This matters far beyond Yemen's borders, because the Houthis have spent the last several years positioning themselves as the most capable and most willing to act node in Iran's regional proxy network, especially compared to a badly degraded Hezbollah in Lebanon. Iranian officials have reportedly floated the idea of closing the Bab el-Mandeb Strait in the Red Sea, the same way Tehran has repeatedly threatened and partially executed closures of the Strait of Hormuz, and a Houthi political bureau member has publicly speculated that a full-blown closure of that waterway could push global oil prices as high as $200 a barrel. Saudi Arabia built an entire pipeline system specifically to move crude across its own territory to the Red Sea and bypass Hormuz in the event of exactly this kind of crisis, and that pipeline's importance just went up substantially. At the United Nations, the Security Council held an emergency session over the flare-up, with a senior UN political affairs official warning member states bluntly that the region cannot survive another cycle of escalation. Whether that warning gets heeded largely depends on choices being made right now, this week, by decision-makers in Riyadh, Sana'a, and Tehran, who are all operating under enormous domestic pressure of their own. Now, here's the three-track pressure campaign that's actually converging on Tehran right now, and understanding all three at once is the only way to make sense of why Iran keeps escalating, even as it keeps losing ground militarily. The first track is financial. The reimposed blockade, combined with the UK's terrorism designation of the IRGC, is squeezing Iran's ability to move oil, access international banking, and fund the very proxy and paramilitary networks it depends on for regional leverage. The second track is military, and it is the most visible one right now. A 6-night strike campaign that has methodically worked through Iran's coastal defense grid, its missile storage architecture, and, as of April, demonstrated reach into its underground command structure. The third track is psychological, and it is arguably the one Iran's fractured leadership is least equipped to handle. State television reportedly cut off a speech from a senior Iranian official mid-sentence in the past week, and hardline clerics aligned with the IRGC have publicly begun describing the June memorandum as an act of treason by their own government. That is not the language of a unified regime managing a war. That is the language of a leadership structure eating itself from the inside, while it's simultaneously being hit from the outside. And when financial pressure, military pressure, and internal psychological fracture converge at the same moment, historically, that is exactly the combination that produces either a negotiated collapse or a much more dangerous, unpredictable escalation, as different factions inside the regime try to prove their own relevance through unilateral action. That fracture inside Tehran's decision-making apparatus is the detail that actually deserves more attention than it's gotten. With Khamenei dead since February and no single figure having consolidated, unquestioned authority over the Revolutionary Guard, its aerospace force, and its naval command in the Gulf, the coordination problem inside Iran's own war effort may now rival the external pressure the country is facing from 3 directions at once. Statements coming out of Tehran this week have been notably inconsistent, alternating between defiant rhetoric about controlling the Strait of Hormuz through Iranian arrangements, not American threats, and quieter signals of continued willingness to negotiate. That inconsistency is not strategic ambiguity. It's very likely the visible symptom of multiple power centers inside Iran's security establishment pulling in different directions, each calculating its own survival separately from the others. At the exact moment, the war demands unified decision-making more than at any point since it began. It's a dynamic playing out beyond Iran's own borders, too. The scramble among hardline Iranian officials to attend Khamenei's funeral in Tehran, and the diplomatic standoff it triggered when Saudi Arabia moved to block a Houthi delegation from flying home from that same funeral, is itself a small window into how much the death of Iran's supreme leader has scrambled the informal hierarchy that used to govern relationships across Tehran's entire proxy network. Funerals are where alliances get renegotiated and loyalties get tested, and the fact that this particular funeral triggered an airport strike and a missile barrage on Saudi Arabia within 72 hours tells you the regional order underneath Iran's proxy structure is every bit as unsettled right now as the chain of command inside Tehran itself. So where does this actually leave things over the next 48 to 72 hours? The evidence points toward continued, possibly intensifying, American strikes on Iran's remaining coastal defense and missile infrastructure, with Pickaxe Mountain remaining the single most consequential unresolved target on the board. Trump has already signaled publicly that the U.S. would move to strike power infrastructure and bridges next if Tehran doesn't return to serious negotiations. A threat that, if acted on, would represent a meaningful escalation beyond the military and IRGC-specific targeting that has defined this phase of the war. Iran, for its part, retains enough dispersed missile and drone capability, hidden in coastal terrain and mobile launch platforms, to keep launching harassment strikes against tankers and regional American positions, even as its centralized command infrastructure absorbs direct hits. That is the uncomfortable truth underneath the dramatic footage. Iran doesn't need a functioning centralized command to keep this war grinding forward at a lower intensity. It just needs scattered cells with cruise missiles and the will to use them, and evidence suggests it still has both. The structural risk that should actually keep serious analysts up at night isn't any single strike. It's the fragmentation of Iranian command authority colliding with a live shooting war. A unified adversary, however hostile, can be negotiated with, deterred, or defeated through a comprehensible chain of escalation and de-escalation. A fractured adversary, with multiple power centers, each capable of ordering strikes independently and each facing its own internal survival pressure, is fundamentally less predictable. That is what makes the reports of internal Iranian dissent, state broadcasts being cut off, hardline clerics denouncing their own government's diplomacy, genuinely more dangerous than any single American strike package, because it raises the odds that some faction inside Iran's security apparatus, acting without full coordination from whatever remains of centralized command, makes a unilateral decision that neither Washington nor the more moderate elements of Iran's own government intended or authorized. A missile aimed at a tanker is a calculated escalation. A missile launched by a faction acting on its own initiative, outside any coherent chain of command, is the kind of variable that turns a contained war into something nobody on either side can fully control. And that brings us back to where we started, to the footage out of Dezful, the sky lit orange with secondary explosions rolling outward long after the initial strike. Somewhere inside a mountain in the Zagros range, construction continues on a facility that both sides know may eventually decide how this entire war ends, one way or another. Whether the next chapter of this conflict is written by a negotiated settlement in a room somewhere or by a 30,000-pound bomb dropped from an aircraft that most radar systems on Earth still can't reliably detect, remains the one question nobody, on either side of this war, can currently answer with certainty.